Commander Sarah Chen stared through the reinforced viewport of the International Space Station's cupola module, her dark eyes fixed on the strange shimmer that shouldn't be there. After 15 years of space missions, she thought she'd seen everything the cosmos could throw at her. She was wrong. "Houston, are you seeing this?" She adjusted the external cameras, trying to capture the peculiar distortion that rippled through the space about 3 kilometers from the station. The phenomenon looked like heat waves rising from hot asphalt, except this was in the vacuum of space where such things simply couldn't exist. Static crackled through her headset. The response from Mission Control came broken and distorted. "Commander, repeat, losing, signal." Sarah frowned. The ISS had the most sophisticated communication system ever developed. They didn't just lose signal anymore, not since the quantum communication upgrades of 2023. She toggled through different frequencies, but each channel produced only variations of the same static. "Doctor Harrison," she called out to the station's science officer, "I need your eyes on this." James Harrison floated into the module, his lanky frame adjusting effortlessly to zero gravity. His typically neat grey hair looked disheveled, as if he'd been running his hands through it repeatedly. A habit she'd noticed he displayed when deeply puzzled by something. "I've been getting strange readings for the past hour," he said, pulling up a holographic display from his wrist computer. "The quantum sensors are showing temporal fluctuations I've never seen before. It's as if..." He paused, frowning at his data. "As if time itself is becoming unstable in that sector." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, despite the station's carefully regulated temperature. She'd learned to trust her instincts over the years, and right now, every fiber of her being was screaming that something was fundamentally wrong. The shimmer expanded slightly, its edges taking on an iridescent quality that reminded her of soap bubbles. Beautiful but deeply unsettling in the black void of space. As she watched, a satellite passed near the distortion's edge. The feed from her camera showed the satellite's movement becoming erratic, its trajectory bending in impossible ways. "Commander," Harrison's voice had dropped to a whisper, "that's the Newton 7, one of our temporal measurement satellites. According to these readings, it's experiencing time at a different rate than we are. Each second for us is," he swallowed hard, "approximately 17 hours for anything within that field." Before Sarah could respond, the station's emergency alerts began blaring. Red warning lights bathed the module in an ominous glow as multiple systems reported simultaneous failures. The primary life support system switched to backup power without warning. Environmental controls fluctuated wildly. "All crew, report to the central hub immediately," Sarah commanded through the station-wide comm. Her voice remained steady, masking the growing unease in her gut. As the 5 other crew members acknowledged her order, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The timestamp on the system alerts showed them occurring 3 hours before she'd first noticed the anomaly. "Harrison," she said, keeping her voice low, "check the atomic clock." The science officer pulled up the display, and Sarah watched as the color drained from his face. The station's atomic clock, the most precise timekeeper ever created by human hands, was running backwards, forwards, and sometimes sideways through time, its quantum digits flickering between impossible combinations. Through the viewport, Earth continued its majestic rotation below them. But now Sarah could see the shimmer beginning to expand, its edges creeping ever closer to the station. And within its iridescent depths, she could have sworn she saw something moving. Something that shouldn't be there, something that couldn't be there. As the crew gathered in the central hub, none of them noticed that the shadow cast by the station on Earth's surface didn't match their current position. Nor did they notice that in Mission Control's live feed, their movements had already played out hours before they made them. The anomaly had found them, and time, it seemed, had other plans for the crew of the International Space Station. The central hub of the ISS typically felt spacious enough for its 6 crew members. Now, with everyone gathered there, the cylindrical chamber seemed to be shrinking. Dr. Harrison's holoscreen projected a 3-dimensional map of the anomaly's expansion, its translucent edges pulsing like a living thing. "The phenomenon is growing at an exponential rate," Harrison explained, his fingers trembling slightly as he manipulated the display. "But that's not the worst part. Look at these temporal signatures." Flight engineer Yuki Tanaka leaned forward. her usually composed features creasing with concern. These patterns, they're impossible. The timestamps show future dates overlapping with past ones. Sarah watched her crew carefully. Besides Harrison and Tanaka, there was Dr. Elena Rodriguez, their medical officer, standing with her arms crossed tightly across her chest. Marcus Webb, their systems specialist, obsessively checking readings on his tablet, and Dr. Peter Chang, their physicist, who hadn't said a word since arriving, but kept staring at the viewport as if expecting something to appear. A low vibration hummed through the station structure, different from its usual mechanical rhythms. Sarah had lived in space long enough to recognize when something was off. The station itself seemed to be resonating with the Anomaly's presence. "Commander," Rodriguez called out suddenly, "you need to see this." She was looking at her medical scanner, confusion evident in her expression. "According to these readings, our cellular decay rates are inconsistent. It's as if different parts of our bodies are experiencing time at different rates." Before Sarah could respond, a crackling sound filled the hub. The communication system came to life, but instead of Houston's familiar voice, they heard something else, their own voices, having a conversation that hadn't happened yet. "I can't risk sending the probe," Sarah heard herself say, "but the readings indicate..." That was Harrison's voice. "Already tried that tomorrow," Tanaka's voice overlapped. The crew stared at each other in stunned silence as their future conversation played out through the speakers. Fragments of discussions about decisions they hadn't made yet, arguments they hadn't had, and discoveries they hadn't uncovered. Marcus suddenly dropped his tablet, his face pale. "Commander, look at the timestamps on these system logs. According to this, I'll be performing maintenance in Sector 7 in 3 hours, but I also supposedly did it 2 hours ago. And these logs, they're in my handwriting, with my authentication codes, but I haven't written them yet." The station shuddered again, more violently this time. Through the viewport, Sarah watched as the Anomaly's iridescent boundary crept closer, its surface now rippling with what looked like waves of chronological distortion. Inside its shifting membrane, she could see what appeared to be ghost images of the station itself, overlaid and transparent, each one showing the ISS in slightly different positions. "Doctor," Chang finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "The quantum entanglement reading, they're showing patterns I've only seen theorized in papers about closed time-like curves. It's as if..." He paused, swallowing hard. "As if time itself is folding in on itself, creating loops and paradoxes." The lights flickered, and for a brief moment, Sarah saw something that made her question her sanity. In that fraction of a second, the hub appeared to be simultaneously pristine and aged decades, new equipment overlaying rusted panels, fresh paint coexisting with centuries of wear. When the light stabilized, everything looked normal again, but the image remained burned in her mind. "We need to establish some sort of baseline," Sarah decided, trying to maintain order in a situation that defied ordinary logic. "Harrison, set up temporal markers throughout the station. Rodriguez, I want continuous monitoring of our biological responses to these fluctuations." Tanaka tried to... She stopped mid-sentence as a series of handwritten notes floated past her face. Notes that she recognized as her own handwriting, containing instructions and warnings she hadn't written yet. As she grabbed one, the paper felt simultaneously crisp and aged, as if it existed in multiple states of decay at once. The note contained just 3 words: "Don't trust time." Through the viewport, Earth continued its rotation, but now Sarah noticed something deeply disturbing. In some sections of the planet's surface, it appeared to be night, while adjacent areas showed broad daylight, a possibility that defied every known law of physics. The anomaly wasn't just affecting the station, it was beginning to influence Earth itself, and somewhere in the distance, barely audible beneath the station's ambient noise, came a sound that shouldn't exist in the vacuum of space, something that sounded almost like laughter. The next 12 hours aboard the ISS defied every law of physics and reason, assuming it had actually been 12 hours. Time measurements had become meaningless, with crew members' watches displaying different times, sometimes varying by days or even years. Dr. Harrison's temporal markers showed that some sections of the station were experiencing time at radically different rates than others. Sarah found herself standing in the research module, staring at an experiment that both had and hadn't happened yet. A row of plant specimens in the hydroponic garden showed impossible states. Some seedlings were simultaneously sprouting and fully grown, existing in multiple stages of development at once. "Commander," Rodriguez's voice came through the intercom, tense and controlled. "We have a situation in the medical bay." When Sarah arrived, she found Rodriguez standing over a blood sample taken from Marcus. The red liquid in the vial swirled in patterns that defied gravity, but more disturbingly, it seemed to be aging and rejuvenating in visible waves. "His latest physical readings are problematic," Rodriguez explained, pulling up a holographic display. "According to these scans, different parts of his body are experiencing time at different rates. His heart is beating at normal rhythm, but his cellular metabolism is operating at speeds that should be fatal." "How is that possible?" Sarah asked, though she already knew there would be no satisfactory answer. "Commander!" Tanaka's panicked voice erupted from the comm system. "The primary computer core. You need to see this." Sarah made her way to the computer core, but the short journey became a surreal nightmare. She passed through sections of the station where the metal walls appeared aged and worn, only to step into areas that looked brand new. In one corridor, she saw multiple versions of herself walking in different directions, echoes of journeys she had made, or would make, or might never make. The computer core was a scene of chaos. Screens flickered with data from past, present, and future missions simultaneously. Tanaka stood in the center, her hands moving frantically over the controls. "The quantum processors are picking up data streams from different time streams," she explained, her voice shaking. "We're getting mission logs from Apollo missions that never happened, future expeditions that haven't been planned yet, and—" She paused, her face paling. "Alternate histories where humanity never reached space at all." A loud groaning sound reverberated through the station's structure. Through the nearest viewport, Sarah watched in horror as sections of the ISS seemed to phase in and out of existence, overlapping with versions of itself from different times. The anomaly had grown larger, now completely surrounding the station in its iridescent embrace. Dr. Chang burst into the room, clutching a tablet with white-knuckled hands. "The quantum field measurements," he gasped. "They're showing patterns that suggest consciousness. The anomaly isn't just distorting time, it's reacting to our presence, to our thoughts." As if in response to his words, the lights throughout the station flickered, and for a moment, Sarah saw something that chilled her to her core. In the reflective surface of a deactivated screen, she caught a glimpse of figures moving through the station, versions of the crew that seemed wrong somehow. Their movements were too fluid, their expressions too empty. Harrison's voice crackled through the comm, distorted and overlapping with itself. "Commander, the temporal readings. They're showing. We've always been here. We've never been here. We will always be here." The station's artificial gravity fluctuated wildly, sending equipment floating in impossible patterns. Sarah watched as a dropped stylus fell upward, while simultaneously rolling across the floor and hovering motionless. All three events occurring in the same space at the same time. Through the chaos, Sarah noticed something even more disturbing. The Earth visible through the viewport no longer looked quite right. Continents seemed to shift and change, showing configurations that had never existed in human history. In some moments, she could see cities glowing with lights that didn't match any known pattern of human civilization. And then she saw it, a reflection in the computer core's main screen that showed the entire crew standing behind her. But when she turned around, the room was empty except for Tanaka, who was staring at her own reflection with horror. In the reflection, their eyes were completely black, and their movements seemed to follow patterns that happened seconds before they made them. The anomaly wasn't just breaking down time, it was breaking down reality itself. And somewhere in the quantum chaos of twisted space-time, Sarah began to suspect that something was watching them, studying their reactions to its cosmic experiment. The laughter they'd heard earlier came again, louder this time, echoing through the station's corridors. But now Sarah realized it wasn't laughter at all. It was the sound of time itself tearing at the seams of reality, and their consciousness was being pulled into the gaps between moments. The situation in the ISS deteriorated rapidly as the crew struggled to maintain their grip on reality. "Doctor," Rodriguez had converted the medical bay into a makeshift temporal observation center, monitoring the increasingly erratic biological readings of the crew. The displays showed their vital signs splitting into multiple concurrent patterns, each following its own temporal logic. "It's getting worse," Rodriguez explained to Sarah, pointing to a series of brainwave patterns. "Our neural activity is showing signs of temporal multiplication. It's as if our consciousness is trying to exist in multiple time streams simultaneously." Sarah watched as her own EEG reading branched into 3 distinct patterns, each one perfectly valid but impossible to exist alongside the others. She felt it too. Memories of events that hadn't happened yet mixing with experiences she'd never had, creating a kaleidoscope of contradictory realities in her mind. Dr. Chang had taken to carrying a quantum field detector everywhere, its readings providing the only semi-reliable measure of their temporal position. "The anomaly's behavior suggests intelligence," he explained, his voice trembling with both fear and excitement. "It's not just random temporal distortion, it's responding to our attempts to study it. It's learning." The crew gathered in the observation module, watching as the shimmer of the anomaly created impossible patterns against the backdrop of stars. Earth below them had become a shifting masterpiece of alternative histories, continents drifting through configurations that had never existed, oceans changing color and position, the lights of civilization blinking in and out like fireflies. "Look at this," Harrison called out, his hands manipulating a holographic display of the station's structural integrity data. The metal itself is experiencing temporal strain. Some sections of the hull are aging centuries in minutes, while others are reverting to their raw mineral state. As if to emphasize his point, a section of wall near them suddenly showed the patina of decades of space exposure, before smoothing back to pristine condition, then briefly becoming transparent as the metal reverted to its component elements. The process repeated in an endless loop, creating a hypnotic pattern that was beautiful and terrifying. Tanaka, who had been analyzing the computer core's quantum data archives, made a startling discovery. "The system is recording messages from us, but they're from versions of us that never existed. Look at this." The screen displayed logs written by alternate versions of the crew, versions from timelines where different choices had been made, different lives lived. Sarah read an entry written by a version of herself who had never become an astronaut, warning about the dangers of space exploration. The entry was dated 50 years in the future, but the timestamp insisted it had been written yesterday. The station's windows now showed multiple versions of space outside, layered like transparent sheets. In one layer, the stars formed unfamiliar constellations. In another, the sun appeared to be in a different stage of its life cycle. Reality was becoming increasingly fluid, with moments flowing into each other like watercolors in the rain. Marcus, who had been quietly monitoring the station's systems, suddenly spoke up. "Commander, I think I understand what's happening. The quantum processors, they're not just receiving data from other time streams, they're actively connecting with them. Each calculation creates a bridge between realities." As he spoke, his image seemed to multiply, showing versions of himself making the same declaration with slightly different words, slightly different gestures. The overlapping voices created an eerie chorus that echoed through the station. Sarah felt a strange sensation, as if her consciousness was expanding to fill multiple spaces at once. She could see through the eyes of other Sarahs, ones who had made different choices, lived different lives. The experience was overwhelming, like trying to watch thousands of movies simultaneously while being the protagonist in each one. Through the cacophony of overlapping realities, a pattern began to emerge. The anomaly wasn't just distorting time, it was collecting it, gathering every possible version of every possible moment into a single point in space-time. And as Sarah watched the swirling chaos outside the station, she realized with growing horror that they weren't just observers of this phenomenon, they were part of its design. The laughter they'd heard earlier returned, but now it seemed to come from inside their own minds. A chorus of their own voices, multiplied across infinite timelines, all realizing the same truth at different moments. The anomaly wasn't a natural phenomenon, it was a construct, a vast cosmic experiment, and they were both the subjects and the observers. In that moment, As multiple versions of reality competed for dominance, Sarah made a discovery that chilled her to her core. Within the quantum processor's data stream, buried beneath layers of temporal distortion, was a message. It was written in code that hadn't been invented yet, using principles of quantum mathematics that humanity wouldn't discover for centuries. But she could read it. Somehow she could read it. And its contents suggested that everything they'd experienced, every moment of temporal chaos, every distortion of reality, was just the beginning. Sarah stared at the quantum display, her mind struggling to process the implications of what she was seeing. The message hidden in the temporal data stream wasn't just a communication, it was a blueprint, a set of instructions encoded into the fabric of space-time itself. "It's a test," she whispered, her voice overlapping with echoes of herself from other timelines. "They're testing our ability to perceive multidimensional time." Harrison moved closer to the display, his expression shifting between confusion and understanding as alternate versions of his consciousness processed the information differently. "Who's testing us, Commander?" "We are," Sarah replied, the words feeling strange in her mouth. "Humanity is, but not our humanity. Not yet." The message, it's from us, from what we become after we learn to manipulate time itself. The station groaned around them, its structure resonating with temporal harmonics that shouldn't exist. Through the windows, the anomaly had transformed the space around them into a kaleidoscope of possibility, each facet showing a different version of reality. "Doctor." Chang's quantum field detector began emitting a series of tones that matched the harmonic frequencies of the station's vibrations. "The patterns," he exclaimed, his eyes wide with realization. "They're not random. They're following a mathematical sequence. It's a language written in the grammar of quantum mechanics." Rodriguez burst into the module, her medical tablet displaying impossible readings. "The crew's neural patterns are synchronizing with the temporal frequencies. It's as if our brains are being tuned like instruments to receive some kind of signal." The air itself seemed to thicken with potential energy as multiple versions of reality compressed into an increasingly narrow band of possibility. Sarah felt her consciousness expanding, connecting with other versions of herself across the quantum spectrum of existence. Tanaka, who had been working frantically at the computer core, made a breakthrough. "The quantum processors aren't just receiving the signal, they're part of its transmission. Every calculation we've made since detecting the anomaly has been adding to the message. We're not just reading it, we're helping to write it." Through the windows, Earth had become a shifting mandala of possibility, each rotation showing a different version of human history. Sarah watched civilizations rise and fall in seconds, saw humanity reach for the stars in 1,000 different ways, witnessed versions of their own mission playing out with countless variations. The laughter they'd been hearing transformed into something else, a harmonious chorus of frequencies that matched the station's vibrations perfectly. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, from every moment and no moment at all. Marcus, his voice steady despite the chaos around them, made an observation that changed everything. The station's orbit. It's not just degrading. It's moving through time like it moves through space. We're not just traveling around Earth. We're traveling through every possible version of Earth simultaneously. As if triggered by his words, the anomaly's iridescent surface began to pulse with new patterns. The quantum message in the computer core updated itself, new information flowing through circuits that existed in multiple temporal states at once. Sarah felt something shift in her mind as the message became clearer. The future versions of humanity weren't just testing them, they were preparing them. The anomaly wasn't a phenomenon to be studied, it was a doorway to be opened. "They're showing us how to step outside of linear time," she said, her voice resonating with the station's harmonic frequencies. "But not just us, every version of us, across every possible timeline. They're teaching humanity how to perceive time the way they do." The crew watched in awe as their multiple reflections began moving in perfect synchronization, thousands of potential versions of themselves converging into singular points of consciousness. The station's quantum processors hummed with energy as they processed calculations that wouldn't be possible for centuries. And then, in a moment that existed simultaneously across countless timelines, Sarah understood the true nature of their mission. The International Space Station hadn't just stumbled upon an anomaly, it had been positioned precisely where it needed to be, when it needed to be there. By minds operating outside the constraints of linear time, they weren't victims of a temporal disaster. They were participants in humanity's first steps toward a new understanding of reality itself. The terror they'd felt wasn't from the unknown. It was from their minds stretching to comprehend concepts they weren't yet equipped to understand. As this realization rippled through the crew's collective consciousness, the anomaly's surface began to change, its patterns shifting into something new, something purposeful. The message in the quantum processors updated one final time, revealing the next phase of their impossible mission. The final message from the quantum processors wasn't just data, it was an invitation. As Sarah and her crew stood in the observation module, their consciousness now existing across multiple time streams simultaneously, they faced a choice that would reshape humanity's understanding of existence itself. The anomaly, Harrison explained, his voice harmonizing with versions of himself from other timelines. It's a gateway. Not just through space, but through every possible version of time. They're showing us how to take the first step. The station had become a nexus point, a place where infinite timelines converged into a single moment of possibility. Through the windows, they could see every version of Earth that had ever existed or could exist, layered like pages in an infinite book. "Look at these readings," Rodriguez said, her medical tablet displaying impossible data. "Our brains aren't just adapting to perceive multiple time streams, they're evolving to process them naturally. We're becoming something new." The quantum chorus that had replaced the mysterious laughter now pulsed through the station in perfect harmony with their heightened consciousness. Each note carried fragments of knowledge from future civilizations, teaching them how to exist beyond the constraints of linear time. Tanaka's work at the computer core had revealed something extraordinary. "The station's systems aren't failing," she explained, her eyes reflecting the shimmer of temporal energy around them. "They're transcending their original design. Every circuit, every processor is being upgraded by our future selves." Through the kaleidoscope of overlapping realities, Sarah watched as versions of their mission played out across countless timelines. In some, they had already made this choice. In others, they were about to. In still others, they were remembering making it. All possibilities existed simultaneously, waiting for their decision to bring them into alignment. Dr. Chang's quantum field detector had evolved beyond its original purpose, now showing them patterns in reality itself. The mathematics of it. "It's beautiful," he whispered. "Time isn't a line or even a web. It's a symphony, and we're learning to hear it." Marcus, his consciousness now fully synchronized with his alternate selves, made the final adjustments to the station's systems. "We're ready, Commander. The quantum processors are aligned with the temporal frequencies. We can do what they're showing us how to do." Sarah stood at the center of the observation module, feeling the weight of infinite possibilities converging on this single moment. The terror they had initially felt had transformed into something else, a profound understanding that they were participating in humanity's next great evolutionary step. The anomaly's surface had become crystalline, each facet showing a different version of their future. But now, instead of causing fear, it filled them with a sense of purpose. They were no longer observers of a phenomenon, they were becoming part of it. "It's not about escaping time," Sarah realized, her voice carrying the wisdom of countless versions of herself. "It's about embracing all of it at once. They're not just showing us how to survive temporal distortion, they're teaching us how to thrive in it." As the crew made their final preparations, the station began to pulse with energy that existed outside of normal space-time. The quantum processors hummed with calculations that rippled backwards and forwards through time, creating a stable loop of causality that encompassed their past, present, and future. Through the windows, they could see their future selves watching them, not as separate entities, but as part of a continuous spectrum of existence. The boundaries between observer and observed, between past and future, between possibility and reality, had become meaningless. Sarah gave the final command, not with words, but with a thought that resonated across all possible timelines. The station's systems responded not just in their present, but in every moment the station had ever existed or would exist. The anomaly wasn't closing or disappearing. It was becoming part of them, just as they were becoming part of it. The International Space Station, once humanity's furthest reach into space, had become humanity's first step beyond the constraints of linear time itself. And somewhere in the quantum chorus of infinite possibility, Sarah heard her own voice, past, present, and future, speaking a truth that echoed across all of existence. Time had never been a barrier to be overcome. It had always been a door, waiting for humanity to learn how to open it. The crew of the ISS hadn't just survived their encounter with the temporal anomaly. They had fulfilled its purpose. They had become the bridge between what humanity was and what it would become, existing in a state that transcended traditional concepts of space and time. And as their consciousness expanded to embrace this new state of being, they understood that their mission wasn't ending. It was transforming into something infinite, eternal, and beautifully, perfectly human.